My stepfather's temptation could destroy everything, and my mom has no idea what's happening between us. Have you ever kept a secret that may destroy everything because it was so risky and enticing? That was my existence, and the secret I kept was as illegal as the subsequent sinister cravings. This is my story, and my name is Isabel. Something inside of me changed the night following my 18th birthday, and now that I'm 19, it all began. This is not what I asked for. Victor wasn't someone I asked for. But here I am, speaking the truth to you. I need to get it off my chest, even if I'm not proud of it. My stepfather, Victor, was no ordinary man. With just a glance, he was able to command the room and exert a silent authority over others. I knew there was something sinister about him from the time he married my mother. However, I believed that danger was not intended for me. Like a breeze that gradually develops into a storm, it started off so innocently. I have a clear memory of that evening. The house was silent and it was late. The only sounds were the waves breaking outside, as though the sea was aware of the mayhem that was developing inside of me. My mother didn't realize the tension was rising below. She was sleeping upstairs. When I arrived downstairs, Victor was seated at the kitchen table, wearing a flimsy robe that hardly fit me. I convinced myself that I wasn't attempting to impress him. However, the slow, methodical manner his eyes followed me gave the impression that he saw me in a way that no one else had. At first, he merely watched without saying anything. Even though it was unsettling, I couldn't help myself. His eyes were heavy and seductive, and something dark and terrible sprang up inside of me at that very moment. As though the room itself could sense the change in our dynamic, the air between us was heavy and nearly oppressive. Then he said, "You're up late," in a low, nearly growling voice. As if daring me to step beyond an unseen line from which none of us could return, his words lingered in the air like a challenge. I said, "I couldn't sleep," as my heart began to race. My feet remained set despite knowing I should leave, defying the logic that was screaming in my head. He grinned, but it was a smile that aroused something deep inside me rather than reaching his eyes. "Spend some time sitting with me, keep me company." I paused, but only briefly. The table felt like a thin wall separating two worlds, one familiar and comfortable, the other unfamiliar and perilous, and before I realized it, I was seated across from him. His fingers brushed mine as his hand went over the table. Even though the touch was fleeting, it made me quiver. It was plenty to make me gasp for air and to get me to doubt every single barrier I believed I had. He said, "I've been watching you," in a softer, more personal tone. I didn't pull away as his fingers lingered for a second longer than they should have. "You're not a little girl anymore, Isabel." My chest was thumping with my heart. I ought to have said something, anything at all, but I was stuck in this weird, perverse moment. His words and the way he gazed at me conveyed a sense of both fear and excitement, as if I were more than simply his stepdaughter and no longer invisible. I was afraid because I was something more. The tension-filled stillness that lingered between us was a result of unsaid wishes seething beneath the surface. My thinking begged me to flee and to put an end to whatever it was before it got out of control. However, my body ignored me. Despite my knowledge that it was improper, I felt a strong attraction to him. "Does it scare you?" As if he could read the struggle brewing within me, he inquired in a voice so silky it was practically a whisper. "The way I look at you?" I tightened my throat and swallowed hard. I was unable to respond. Rather, I found myself standing and moving toward him around the table as though I were unable to escape some unseen force. As I got closer, his body tensed and his eyes darkened. The heat of his presence and the way the air between us seemed to vibrate with expectation caused me to stop a few inches from him. I felt a shock of electricity as his hand extended and brushed across my arm's sensitive flesh. My body betrayed me once more, and I let out a quiet gasp. Even when I muttered, "You know this can't happen," I didn't believe myself. A different story was revealed by the way I shuddered under his touch. He whispered, "And yet here you are," as his hand moved up my arm and settled on my shoulder. I felt my body lean into his touch as his thumb touched the side of my neck, seeking it in a manner I couldn't quite put my finger on. I tried to ignore the guilt that was eating at me by closing my eyes, but it didn't help. I had gone too far. My heart was pounding, my breathing was shallow, and I could feel his hot, seductive breath on my skin. I wanted to halt. I had to quit. However, I was unable to. With his lips so close to mine that I could just taste the forbidden, he said, "What do you want, Isabel?" I opened my eyes and looked him in the eye. The same yearning that boiled within me was seen in his eyes. But before I could respond, the moment was cut short by the sound of footsteps coming from upstairs. Mom was up. I took a step back, the reality of what nearly happened rushing down around me, my heart thumping in my chest. Victor flashed a sly smile, as though he had just won a devious game. He got up and brushed by me, his hand caressing my waist as he went. "We should talk again sometime," he muttered. The moment was over in an instant. However, the fire he had kindled within me was unquenchable. "And you, how would you respond if I were you? Would you walk away or give in to temptation? Tell us what you think in the comments section below. I need to understand that I'm not alone in feeling torn between good and wrong. I couldn't get that night out of my head. I wasn't sure I could resist the way Victor's breath brushed across my lips and the way his touch shot sparks through my skin. The power he had over me, a subtle unsaid authority that both scared and made me feel alive, was more than simply the physical. And we started playing the game seriously after that evening. Days went by, and on the surface, everything appeared to be as usual. My mother was blissfully oblivious, as though she was unaffected by the tension in the air. However, every look, every word and every moment we shared became electrified between Victor and me. It was approaching something that neither of us could stop, like a slow-burning fuse. I made an effort to stay away from him, telling myself that it was the proper course of action. I spent more time in my room, concentrated on my coursework, or went to the beach to get some fresh air and let the sound of the waves soothe my mind. But the memory of his touch followed me everywhere like an unseen hand. Things got out of hand on a Saturday afternoon. Victor and I were left alone while my mother left for some errands in town. I had promised myself that I would remain in my room, stay away from him, and maintain my normalcy. However, as the hours passed, the house's silence tormented me, and the more I considered it, the more I found myself straying downstairs, attracted to the peril like a moth to a flame. He was reading a newspaper in the living room as if nothing had ever transpired between us. However, I could sense him. Every part of me knew about him. I remained there with my heart pounding, not sure if I should approach him or head back upstairs. But my body had already decided and was moving in closer. He continued, "I see you've come out of hiding," in a calm voice that had a tinge that made my heart race. I could tell he felt me even though his gaze remained fixed on the newspaper. "Is this the way things will be going forward, Isabel? Me chasing, you running?" I tried to say, "I'm not running," but my voice deceived me. We were both aware that I was lying. "Really?" Now, his tone was playful, as though he were challenging me to tell the truth. When he eventually lowered the newspaper and met my gaze, the magnetic force between us returned with greater vigor than before. "Because it seems like that's exactly what you've been doing." I started to reply, but the words became stuck in my throat. Rather, I simply stood there and gazed at him, feeling the gravity of the situation increase. My mind cried out for me to get out, to return upstairs, and to stop this risky game before it continued. However, my body had other ideas. With his gaze fixed on mine, Victor reclined in his chair. He whispered, "Come here." But it wasn't a request. It was a command, and I felt a shock of energy. After a brief moment of hesitation, I moved forward. I was unable to stop myself. I was unwilling to stop. As I walked toward him, my heart thumping louder with every step, the space felt too small and too hot. When I got close enough, he extended his hand and ran it up my arm, causing my skin to tingle from the heat of his touch. Breathless, I waited there, anticipating the next move. After that, he carefully and slowly drew me onto his lap. The way his hand slid over me and the feel of his body beneath mine was seductive, even though I knew it was wrong. My entire body was ablaze, with every nerve begging for more. Even so, a tiny voice in the back of my mind kept reminding me of the repercussions and that my mother was only a few miles away and was totally unaware of the treachery taking place right in front of her. "What are we doing?" I didn't know if I wanted an answer, so I whispered. Victor's lips touched my ear as his hands closed tighter around my waist. His breath was hot against my skin as he whispered, "Exactly what you want." His fingers moved slowly in circles around my exposed skin as they slid under the hem of my shirt, giving me chills with every touch. My body betrayed me once more as I leaned toward him when I should have stopped him and backed away. I felt my breath catch as his hands rose higher and his fingertips touched the curvature of my waist. The distinction between right and wrong became hazy, and my only thought was how wonderful it felt to be wanted and caressed in this way. I began to say, "We can't." But my words were halting and unconvincing. Already I was leaning into him, wanting and needing more. He pressed his lips to my neck and said, "We already are," which caused my veins to boil up. My body shook with anticipation as I let out a faint gasp as his fingers crept lower, hinting at the border of the forbidden. But before anything further could happen, there was a knock on the door. The moment broke as we both froze. Panic was coursing through my veins as my heart raced. My mom couldn't have returned by now, could she? With a dark, menacing flicker in his eyes, Victor's hand slipped away from me. "Go," he urged softly. His tone calm yet forceful, as though nothing unusual had just occurred. "Upstairs. Now." I refrained from arguing. With my legs shaking, I leaped from his lap and rushed back to my room, my thoughts racing. With my heart racing and the realization of what nearly transpired weighing heavily on me, I closed the door behind me. I tried to quiet the roaring tempest of emotions inside of me by pressing my back against the door and breathing heavily. There was still heat between us, simmering beneath the surface, waiting to burst at the next chance. How would you have responded? Remaining or walking away? I don't even know what I'm doing anymore, so please let me know in the comments. Even though I made an effort to suppress it, the guilt kept eating away at me. I kept thinking about Victor's hands on me and the fire between us whenever I was by myself. As if he knew precisely how to pull me apart, I would close my eyes and feel his breath on my neck and the way his fingers had moved over my flesh. I felt alive, even powerful, but that strength had a cost, and I wasn't prepared to pay it. My mother had no suspicions. Unaware of the chaos simmering beneath the surface, she continued to live her days with the same radiant smile. I saw that I was avoiding her more and more and stayed away from her whenever I could. I didn't want her to ask me questions I couldn't answer or see the shame in my eyes. I was too terrified to witness the extent of the harm that would be caused when the truth ultimately exploded because it was a ticking time bomb. The situation worsened once more on a Sunday afternoon. Victor and I were alone again since my mom had gone to see a friend across town. Since that day in the living room, the air between us had become more dense. Every interaction was a game we were both playing and neither of us had the guts to stop, a quiet challenge. I pretended to read while I sat on the back porch, but my gaze kept going to the open door behind me. I could feel him, the weight of his presence raising the hair on the back of my neck, and I knew he was inside. With him so near, I was unable to concentrate as my fingers fumbled with the pages. I knew it was him before I even turned when the door cracked open. He went outside, moving slowly and deliberately, as though he wanted me to have time to respond. With every stride he took toward me, my pulse quickened and my heart raced. "Isabel," he said in a quiet, nearly whispery voice, as though we were exchanging secrets. We were, in a sense. I swallowed hard and put the book down without giving him a glance. I was unable to. I knew I wouldn't be able to control myself if I did. He said, "We need to talk," as he approached and cast his shadow over me. Instead of taking a seat, he simply stood there, looming over me like some evil entity against which I was powerless. I managed to say, "I don't think that's a good idea," though my voice was a little shaky. He knelt next to me, so close I could feel the heat emanating from his body. "You know we can't pretend this didn't happen." My breath caught in my throat as I finally turned to face him. Something I couldn't identify but sensed deep within me was visible in his black eyes. It was more than just desire. It was dangerous. It was the excitement of knowing that we were tinkering with fire and that we dared to allow it to devour us. I said, "I'm not pretending." But I knew it was a lie as soon as I said it. Victor's fingertips touched my skin in a way that made me shiver as he reached out and brushed a lock of hair away from my face. "Don't you sense it? This is between us. It won't go away." I ought to have gotten up, left and put an end to this before things got out of hand. However, I remained motionless, my body deceiving me once more. His presence was overwhelming, and his touch was electric. Even though I knew I would get burned, I couldn't help but be pulled to him like a moth to a flame. "Victor!" My voice trembled with a mixture of excitement and dread, barely audible. His breath was hot against my ear as he leaned closer. He muttered, "Tell me to stop," as his lips touched my flesh. "Tell me you don't want this." I ought to have said it. I ought to have told him to stop and go away. However, I didn't. I was unable to. As an alternative, I turned to face him, our lips almost touching. The tension between us was heavy and intolerable, and my heart was thumping in my chest. The words, "I can't," escaped my lips before I could stop them. I was pulled to my feet by Victor's hand as it moved down my arm and wrapped around my wrist. He held on tight. Standing so close that our bodies nearly touched, he held me there. As the attraction between us took hold, the outside world appeared to fade into the background. He said, "You don't want me to stop," in a confident tone, as though he knew me better than I did. "You've been considering it. It's visible in your eyes." My breath came in short spurts as I bit my lip. I detested his accuracy and ability to read me. I thought about him, what we could do and what we had already done whenever we were alone. The urge was stronger than anything I had ever experienced, yet the guilt was still present. I was drawn closer when Victor's hand moved to my waist. His body was pushed against mine, and I could feel the searing heat between us. He teased, taunted, and dared me to give in as his lips lingered over mine. My body desired this, but my head and heart were screaming for me to leave. This is what I wanted. He whispered, "Tell me what you want, Isabel." His lips grazing mine, just barely touching. I was unable to talk. My mind was racing with contradictory feelings, and my throat felt constricted. I had no choice but to lean into him, close my eyes, and wait for the inevitable to come. However, a car pulled into the driveway before our lips could touch. The truth of what we were going to do hit me like a tidal wave, and I jerked away as my eyes snapped open. My mom was at home. Victor took a step back, his expression unreadable. The fire between us remained, simmering just below the surface, waiting for the next opportunity to explode, even though the time was past. If you were in my position, how would you respond? Would you turn away or allow yourself to sink further? Tell me in the comments below. I must understand that I am not alone in this problem. Long after the moment was over, I could still feel the heat of his touch. The tension between us was intensifying and taking over every silent moment, every look and every word spoken in private. In an exciting and terrifying way, Victor had a way of making me feel needed and seen. And suddenly the distinction between good and wrong became increasingly hazy with every day that went by. Everything changed that night. Victor and I were alone once more after my mother left for the evening. I made an effort to persuade myself that everything would be all right and that I could live with him in the same home without developing the same risky habits. However, I felt in my heart that I was deceiving myself. I heard him behind me as I was idly tidying up in the kitchen after supper. I felt that familiar thrill of eagerness when I heard his footsteps. I knew it was him without even turning around. Unspoken anxiety thickened the air as it shifted. Victor said, "You're quiet tonight," in his usual smooth and low voice. He drew nearer until I could feel his body heat behind me. As I dried a plate, my hand shaking, I lied and said, "I'm just tired." Naturally, he didn't believe me. His eyes were on me, waiting, watching. He was always able to tell when I was lying and when I was attempting to hide. However, it never succeeded. Even when I tried to pull away, Victor had a way of drawing me back in. "You've been avoiding me," he murmured quietly, with a hint of wicked humor in his voice. "Why?" I took a deep breath and tried to concentrate on the task at hand. I murmured, "I haven't." But even I thought the words sounded weak. He whispered, "Isabel." And I felt a chill go through me when I heard my name. I could feel his breath on my neck now that he was so near. "Observe me." I paused, holding the towel in my hands tighter. My body was deceiving me once more, pulling me toward him despite my knowledge that it was wrong, despite my mind's cries for me to move away and put as much distance between us as possible. I turned to him slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I could see that same need, that same deadly intensity that prevented me from thinking clearly, when his dark eyes met mine. I was caught when he moved closer and pressed me up against the counter. The intense yearning that had been growing between us for weeks was trapped between him and me. He stated in a deep, confident voice, "You can't keep running from this. You sense it. I am certain that you do." He reached out and gently but purposefully brushed his fingertips on my cheek, causing my breath to catch in my throat. I felt the heat rising in my body and my pulse speeding as the touch gave me a shock of electricity. I said, "We can't." But even I found the words to be weak and unconvincing. "And yet," he whispered, drawing me in closer as his hand moved down to rest on my waist. "We're here." I ought to have shoved him aside. I ought to have urged him to cease. However, I didn't. Rather, my body betrayed every logical notion I had, and I stood there. I felt the air between us get thicker and heavier as his hand crept lower, following the curvature of my waist, as though the room itself knew we were about to do something we couldn't undo. With guilt still gnawing at me, I muttered, "I don't want to hurt her." Yet my body still leaned toward his touch, yearning for it. Victor's voice was a sensual whisper as his lips touched my ear. "She is not involved in this. This concerns us." I felt the tightness coil inside of me tighten as I closed my eyes. His hands were all over me, soft yet firm, and I could feel myself slipping, sinking more into the pit we had made. Like a fire that threatened to devour all in its path, the heat between us was intolerable. With his lips grazing the side of my neck, he muttered, "Tell me to stop," sending chills down my spine. "Tell me you're not interested in this." However, I was unable to. My hands went to his chest, and as I felt the hard planes of his body against mine, I pushed him closer rather than pushing him away. My senses were overwhelmed by the warm, musky, delicious scent of him, which impairs judgment and prevents me from thinking about anything but him. "I can't." I said in a tremulous but honest voice. I am unable to stop. All he needed was that. It was as though the world vanished when his lips struck mine. Only we were there, and the heat was all-consuming and oppressive, threatening to suffocate us both. As our bodies crushed together, the tension between us finally broke as his hands tangled in my hair and drew me in closer. I could feel his breath catch. The illicit yearning that had been bubbling beneath the surface for so long had us engrossed in one another. His touch was all over me, burning my skin and causing pain I didn't know was conceivable. And I was unable to stop. I had no desire to. But then everything fell apart as fast as it had started. We both snapped out of the moment as we heard a creak of floorboards coming from the hallway. Our bodies remained squeezed together as we froze, breathing raggedly. Panic swept through me as my heart thumped in my chest. Were we spotted? Was there anyone who heard? There was a flash of something there. Something dangerous. But Victor was the first to pull away, his eyes dark and unreadable. The tension in the air was still heavy and oppressive, yet he straightened and smoothed his shirt as though nothing had happened. He said in a promising whisper, "We'll finish this later," and turned to leave me standing there, gasping for air and feeling as though the weight of what we had just done was bearing down on me. If you were in my shoes, how would you respond? Would you have allowed yourself to fall further, or could you have prevented it? I need to know that I'm not the only one having this problem, so please let me know in the comments. The ensuing days were a haze of yearning and shame. My intellect begged me to stop, but every time I saw Victor, my body tensed with anticipation. But after what had transpired in the kitchen, halting was no longer an option. I was too lost, too enmeshed in a web of passion and feelings that I was unable to break free from. The tension was intense every time we passed each other in the house, even though I hadn't talked to Victor since that night. Thick and oppressive, it hovered between us, a continual reminder of what we had accomplished, and what we still needed to do. My mother was too preoccupied with her own world to realize what was going on right in front of her. The situation changed on a Friday night. Victor and I were once again alone after my mother traveled for the weekend to see some relatives. I should have gone to a friend's house or found a reason to leave, but I chose to stay even though I knew it was risky. I felt compelled to stay and watch where this perverse game would lead us. There was a knock on the door while I was in my room. Knowing who it was before I even opened it made my heart skip a beat. He was standing there when I did, leaning nonchalantly against the doorframe and staring at me with his black eyes. This time, there was no need for small talk or pretense. We both understood his purpose. "Can I come in?" Victor spoke in a low, velvety voice that melted into my skin. I ought to have declined. My pulse was pounding as I shut the door behind him, but instead of closing it and ending it there, I moved aside to let him in. The weight of all we had left unsaid hung in the air between us, making it electrifying. Victor was in the center of the room, his presence strong and overwhelming. With each second that went by, I felt the attraction between us growing stronger than before. "You've been avoiding me," he stated in a composed yet determined tone. Like he was already formulating his next move, his gaze wandered over me, resting on my lips and neck. "I had to," I said, saying hardly louder than a whisper. "I didn't know how to face you after." He interrupted me as he moved in closer, his fingers cupping my chin. My legs went weak as his thumb brushed across my bottom lip in a forceful yet tender manner. His breath was hot against my skin as he muttered, "You don't have to be afraid. This is between us, no one else." With his hands on me and him so near, I tried to slow my breathing by closing my eyes, but it was impossible. Every word and every touch was like fuel for an uncontrollable inferno. I said, "Victor, we can't keep doing this?" But I didn't believe what I was saying. I was already leaning into him, wanting his warmth and touch. He didn't say anything in response. Rather, his hand moved to my waist and drew me to him. His lips touched my ear and I could feel his heartbeat, steady and powerful. With a low growl that chilled my spine, he whispered, "Tell me you don't want this." But I was unable to express it. Nor with my body reacting to him already. Nor with his hands on me. I put my hands on his chest and rather than pushing him away, I drew him in, needing him as much as I needed air. The world seemed to collapse when Victor's lips struck mine. As his hands moved over my body, burning my skin, there was only the heat between us and nothing else. I couldn't get enough of his claiming, possessive touch. I needed and desired more. With our bodies entangled in a tangle of limbs and longing, we staggered back toward the bed. He was touching every part of me, including my neck, waist and hips, as if he was attempting to commit every detail to memory. In the way he made me feel and the way he made everything else vanish, I was engrossed in it. However, the sound of a phone ringing broke the moment just when the tension was at its highest. Both of us froze, our bodies still pushed together, our breaths labored. My phone buzzed with an incoming call while it was resting on the nightstand. I felt sick to my stomach as I looked at the screen. My mom was the one. As though challenging me to respond, Victor's dark, menacing gaze locked with mine. "Don't," he said in a low, authoritative whisper. As his hand moved up my thigh, I was reminded of the heat that still burned between us and the situation we were in. However, I was unable to ignore the call. With my heart thumping in my chest, I gently pulled him aside and reached for the phone. "It's my mom," I responded, my voice wavering. In an attempt to calm my breathing, I put the phone to my ear, but my heart continued to race. I tried to sound natural when I said, "Hey Mom," but my voice sounded breathless. "Is everything okay?" My mother's worried voice said, "Sweetheart, you sound off," over the phone. I looked at Victor, who was grinning at me, that sinister, perilous yearning still shining in his eyes. I tried to gather myself, but my heart was pounding. I lied and said, "Yeah, everything's fine. Just tired, I guess." "Well, I wanted to give you an update. I will return on Sunday night. Please look for yourself." "I will," I said, putting the phone down as fast as I could. Victor was on me once more as soon as the connection finished, his lips grazing my neck and his hands moving up my sides. "Now where were we?" His voice was full of hope as he whispered. However, something had changed within me. The truth of what we were doing struck me like a wave, despite how much I wanted him and how much my body yearned for his touch. The guilt was unbearable, and my mother was out there, totally oblivious to the treachery taking place behind her back. "Victor, stop," I said in a tremulous voice as I pushed him away. He stared at me and hesitated, his eyes narrowing as though he was trying to determine whether I was serious. "I can't do this," I replied, hardly raising my voice above a whisper. "Not like this." With his eyes black with annoyance and his jaw clenched, Victor took a step back. "You can't keep running from this," he continued in a menacingly low voice. "You know you want this as much as I do." However, I stepped back and shook my head, my heart thumping in my chest. "I need time." He looked at me for a long time, and I briefly believed he was trying to press the matter. Then, with a low growl of annoyance, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, gasping for air and feeling shaky from the pressure of what we had nearly done. For the following few days, I tried to tell myself that I had made the correct choice and that I had to push Victor away. However, what is the reality? In all honesty, I was barely able to keep my composure. I could still feel his hands on me and hear his deep, authoritative voice telling me not to run every time I closed my eyes. I had no desire to flee, not from him. However, the weight of our actions and the remorse were too great. But I couldn't get him out of my head. He seemed to have taken up residence in every part of me, including my body and mind. I could feel him haunting me even when we weren't together, drawing me back into that dangerous dark world where we were the only ones who cared. And I knew I couldn't avoid it no matter how hard I tried. On a Thursday night, everything went wrong. I was alone, trying to concentrate on anything other than Victor as my mom was expected to be home late from work. However, it was useless since he had entered my thoughts and the urge would not go, no matter how hard I tried to stop it. The entrance door creaked open as I was in the living room. A beat skipped in my chest. Even before I saw him, I knew it was him, that this was the moment I had been trying to avoid but was unable to do so. As he entered the room, the air changed, heavy with unsaid tension, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Victor's eyes immediately met mine. They were intense and black, filled with the same need that had drawn me in. He didn't have to say anything. I could tell everything I needed to know by the way he looked at me. The match was over. The point of no return had been reached. At last, he whispered in a low, menacing voice, "I can't stop thinking about you." His eyes never left mine as he stepped closer. "I think about you and nothing else, Isabel." My heart was thumping in my chest, and my pulse was getting faster. I wanted to push him away once more, but I couldn't find the right words. I was immobilized and unable to breathe as I stood there, trapped in his gravity. In 2 steps, Victor drew closer to me, pulling my face up to meet his eyes as his palm cupped my chin. Heat sparks raced through my body as a result of his electric touch. I shook, torn between wanting to go and wanting him to draw me closer. I shivered as he said, "I tried to stay away but I can't." His thumb grazing my bottom lip. "I'd prefer not to." His words gave me a sudden surge of need that made it impossible for me to fight or think about what I knew was coming. I was already leaning into him, wanting to feel his lips against mine and his warm skin. I desired him. I asked him. I said, "I can't do this," but I knew it was a lie even as I said it. I knew I was too far gone to stop now based on the way my body reacted to him and how my pulse raced whenever he came close. With his lips grazing my ear and his voice dark and full of promise, he said, "Yes, you can. This is what you desire. You desire me." His hand moved down to my waist and pulled me against him, causing me to moan quietly. He pushed me closer, his breath hot against my neck, and the heat between us was terrible, burning every nerve in my body. He snarled, his lips moving down my throat and chilling me as he said, "Tell me you don't want this. I will stop if you tell me to." However, I was unable to. My hands went to his chest, and as my fingers tangled in his shirt, I drew him closer rather than pushing him away. He held me tightly, as if he never wanted to let go, and I could feel the strength in his arms and the hard planes of his body beneath my hands. "Victor?" With the weight of what we were going to accomplish, my voice was wavering and hardly more than a whisper. I was engrossed when his lips met mine, hot and demanding. The fire that had been raging between us for so long could not be extinguished. His hands were all over the place, claiming, investigating and erasing everything but the feelings he gave me. I couldn't get enough of his hot, desire-filled kiss and possessive touch. Tangled in one another, we staggered back till we struck the couch. With his hands on my waist, Victor drew me down onto his lap and gave me a passionate, intense kiss, as if he was scared I might vanish if he released his hold. I didn't vanish. I completely caved. I was unable to think clearly or concentrate on anything but him as his hands ran over my body. His lips on mine, his breath heated against my skin, and his hands made me forget about everything else. Nothing else mattered to me because I was engrossed in him and the way he made me feel alive. However, something broke just as the tension was about to explode. I froze in place as I heard a car door slam outside. With panic coursing through my veins, my heart halted. Mom. She arrived home early. As we both recognized what was happening, Victor stiffened beneath me and tightened his hold on my waist. As the sound of footsteps neared the front door, I clambered off his lap, my heart pounding. "We must stop," I muttered, my voice shaking with sorrow and terror. "She is unable to know." Victor stood straightening his clothes, his jaw clenched, his eyes black and unreadable. Even though the sound of the front door opening sent a shockwave through us, he remarked softly and confidently, "This isn't over." Before I could gather my breath, my mother entered the room and her upbeat voice filled the air. I tried to act normal, as though nothing was wrong, and I forced a grin despite my beating heart. But I realized Victor was correct as we looked at each other across the room. There was still a long way to go. If you were in my position, how would you respond? Would the truth destroy everything, or could you keep the secret? I need to know I'm not alone in this, so please share your thoughts in the comments section. I felt suffocated by the secret. It weighed heavily on my chest every morning when I woke up, and I knew that it would all fall apart eventually when I went to bed each night. Even though Victor hadn't shoved me since that evening in the living room, I could tell it wasn't finished by the way he looked at me and the implicit promises that burned in his eyes. It would never end. My mother was unaware, fully engrossed in her daily routine, living her life as if nothing were amiss. But it was all wrong. I was mistaken. Victor and I were tense, like a quiet storm simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the right opportunity to blow up. Things ultimately reached a breaking point on a Friday evening. I was alone with him when my mom left again. The home was too quiet, and as soon as the door behind her closed, I could feel the air getting thicker. I made an effort to divert my attention and appear as though nothing would happen, but my body knew better. I was unable to resist the pull toward him since it was stronger than before. I heard him coming while I was in the kitchen, idly doing the dishes. His steps were deliberate and slow, and my heart thumped harder in my chest with each one. I didn't need to turn around, so I didn't. I was aware that he was waiting and observing me. His voice sent chills down my spine as he whispered, "Isabel." Like a storm approaching, his presence became overwhelming as he drew nearer. I didn't answer. I was unable to trust myself or my voice. Rather, I held onto the sink's edge, my knuckles whitened as I struggled against the surge of need that swept over me. However, it was pointless. I could do nothing to stop him. I could feel the heat radiating off Victor's body as he moved closer until he was directly behind me. An electric shock went through me as his hand lightly and playful touched my arm. I bit my lip and closed my eyes to avoid making a sound, but my body was already turning against me and embracing his touch. He pressed his lips to my ear and said, "You can't keep avoiding this. You can't continue to avoid me." The sensation of his breath against my skin made me tremble, and every syllable made my heart race. His fingertips traced languid circles across my bare flesh as his hand traveled to my waist and slid under the hem of my shirt. As I fought to maintain my grounding and maintain some kind of control, My breath caught and my hold on the sink tightened, but it was slipping, quickly. Even though my voice was weak and wobbly, I managed to mumble, "I'm not avoiding you." With a quiet laugh, Victor gripped my waist tightly and drew me back to him. I was unable to focus on anything else because I could feel his strong body and his heat radiating into me. He said, "You're lying," as his lips touched the side of my neck, making me feel hot. "However, it's all right. I am aware of your desires." The fire that had been smoldering between us for so long was ignited by his words, which were like a match striking something deep inside of me. I was unable to resist it any longer. I had no desire to. The tension between us crackled like a live wire as I turned in his arms and met his eyes. As he looked down at me with a deep and intense gaze, his hands moved up to cup my face, his thumbs grazing my cheeks. "I want you," he whispered in a low, desperate voice. "I've desired you forever." Every part of me shook with anticipation as I peered up at him, my breath coming in short spurts and my heart thumping in my chest. The want that was running through me was too intense and overwhelming, even though I knew I should go and stop this before it got out of hand. I slipped the confession out of my mouth before I could stop it, whispering, "I want you too." It only required that. I was lost when Victor's lips smashed into mine. The kiss was intense, demanding, and filled with the long-suppressed yearning we had been suppressing. His hands moved over my body, drawing me in and squeezing me into him as if he and I could not get enough. I desired him. I asked him. Tangled in one another, we staggered back and collided with the kitchen counter. With his hands on my hips and his tongue caressing mine, Victor hoisted me onto it and sent waves of ecstasy through me as he kissed me. Eager for more, eager for anything, I put my legs around him and drew him in. I gasped as the cool air touched my skin as his hand moved beneath my shirt and lifted it over my head. But it was short-lived. Once more, his lips were on me, moving across my collarbone and down my neck, making me shudder every time. I held him to me with my fingers entangled in his hair because I needed to feel him, the warmth of his mouth against my flesh. His voice was hoarse with need as he whispered against my skin, "I've been waiting so long for this. So long." I was unable to talk. My body was shaking with anticipation as his hands felt every inch of me and I was breathing in short breaths. In the fire that was devouring us both, I was drowning in him and the way he made me feel. However, the front door banged as we were ready to cross the last line. My mother was at home. The sound of footsteps reverberated along the corridor, and we both stopped, our hearts thumping simultaneously. As I scurried down the counter and put my shirt back on, my mind racing and my heart racing, I was breathing in sharp breaths. As Victor fixed his clothes, his chest rose and fell with slow, deliberate breaths, his jaw was taut, and his eyes were dark with frustration. With a quiet, hopeful voice he muttered, "This isn't over." Before I could even nod, my mother entered the kitchen, greeting us with bright, unblinking eyes, utterly ignorant to the recent storm. But I realized Victor was correct as we looked at each other across the room. There was still a long way to go. If you were in my position, how would you respond? Would everything fall apart, or would you be able to keep the secret? I need to know I'm not alone in this, so please share your thoughts in the comments section below. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.